Well, good morning and also good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining FSMA Friday for July 2021. My name is Aaron Bolshaw, moderator for FSMA Fridays, which, as most of you know, is an ongoing monthly industry update for food and beverage facility operators, your QA and safety compliance professionals. Safety Chain teams up with the Atchison Group, as always, to bring you guidance and thought leadership on a lot of great topics revolving around Food Safety Modernization Act. So today we're reviewing the FDA food traceability proposal, getting a little bit more specific around a new part of this in 204D that was proposed, and we'll get to it about this 24-hour turnaround. Excuse me. But I don't want to get too far ahead right now. Everyone is on mute, but as always, we want to hear from you. We know you have some questions, and we're here to help you through some of these as we change. But we'll stay flexible with our time. We wanted to be about 30 minutes today. We might go a little over because it is a lot of really great stuff. So, and we do want to get to those questions at the end. So use that webinar console on the right to ask questions through the presentation. We'll save them at the end. So, want to introduce you today. If you haven't heard from him already, we've done a lot of work with Eric Edmunds from the Atchison Group. He's the Director of Food Safety, and he's got a great combination of legal, regulatory, and food industry expertise. He's been with TAG for many, many years now and certified in HACCP. He's a registered environmental health specialist with NEHA and FSMA Preventative Controls qualified individual for human food. So Eric, welcome to FSMA Friday again.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we actually, Safety Chain put a post out on Facebook to promote today's webinar, and it got some interesting replies. So we were talking about the 24-hour proposal for electronic sortable records. Again, we'll get to that later. But we saw some people like kind of, well, I'll just call it, they gave some pretty sharp dialogue, and I sensed we hit a nerve. So I'm really happy that we're going to clear some of that stuff up. We had some people saying, well, Big Brother, and some stuff about say goodbye to your farmers markets and things like that. So glad you're here with us. Before we get into the meat of this and we go through that review for the traceability part, why don't you give us an update, Eric, on what's happening in the latest FSMA updates?
Yeah, well, there's always updates in general about kind of how FSMA is now being enforced. FDA has definitely gone past the education before regulation aspect, and you're seeing a lot of that, particularly with kind of FSVP, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program inspections and things. But in the last month since the last FSMA Friday, really the bigger updates, we've actually gone through the 1-year anniversary of the new era of smarter food safety, where FDA outlined kind of their goals and plans for the next 10 years on kind of how FSMA is going to go and how other programs at FDA are going to go. So a few of the key things that they pointed out: enhanced food traceability. We'll talk about today with the food traceability rule, of course, is a major goal. But two other things that they've emphasized in some of their discussions about the 1-year anniversary is the use of predictive analytics by the FDA in two specific programs. The 21 Forward program is actually really influenced by the pandemic and COVID. It's actually a program where FDA is using the data made by CDC about COVID outbreaks and things, and using that data to kind of determine where there may be supply chain disruptions in our food supply chain. And then the import screening, where the FDA has kind of adapted a new program where they're using artificial intelligence to identify the imports that are coming into the United States that are most likely to contain or have food safety hazards that haven't been controlled. So really, they're not able to inspect everything that's coming in, and that's artificial intelligence is helping them prioritize which ones to inspect and which ones to look into. And the other aspect is they wanted to start exploring new ways to conduct inspections. The key point there, and we've seen it a lot from the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is the idea of remote inspections or conducting parts of an inspection remotely, particularly when the investigators weren't able to get on site and see things, and they don't really need to for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program since it's all records-based. So they've really taken an initiative to still conduct inspections, even though they're not allowed, they're not really able to be in the field as much as they have been in the past. And they're also using some of that CDC data now to determine when inspectors will be back in facilities. And in the last few months, we've really seen an uptick in the actual inspections that are taking place. But they'll continue to explore other options to perform inspections and ensure that the food supply is safe. Then just real recently in the last week, they have released a lot of user fees. Not everyone's familiar with these probably, but there's some things out there. The first one that I list there is re-inspections. Basically, if you are inspected by the FDA and they find something that's in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and they determine they want to re-inspect you to verify that you've either implemented corrective actions or they just want to check in on you, they're actually authorized to charge you for that inspection. So they've released a number, basically right around $300 an hour for the time the inspector needs to travel, prepare, or conduct re-inspections. And then third-party certification programs applies to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, where accreditation bodies and certification bodies can get approved or reviewed by FDA to do kind of a true accredited audit of facilities. And those are some steep fees. Kind of the annual fees are around $2,000, but the application fees and renewal fees for accreditation bodies and certification bodies are up more in the $45,000 range for those that are working with those type of operations. And finally, the voluntary qualified importer program is basically a way for companies to prevent stoppages at the border and get their imports in faster. And for this year or this next year for that is going to be right around $16,000. Very few people participate in that. Costco was the first one that ever did it, but it's largely for those companies that are importing a lot of food and want to ensure that any FDA review gets expedited for them.
I love that. That's interesting. That's kind of like the global entry or that clear when you step on a plane and you're coming back to the US, or if you're going abroad, you get through that line a lot quicker. Interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. If they get stopped at the border, they jump to the front of the line.
That's great. Hey, I wanted to, Eric, just stop real quick, offer 2 points of consideration on that enhanced food traceability, on the predictive analytics and the AI. Just from a software perspective, just want to make sure everyone understands what that really looks like from the bits and bytes that really go on underneath it. Predictive analytics is going to be more of that human-based algorithm where you set up models that are intended to predict where they should, what's going to go on, right? It's a very human-powered initiative. You test, retest, you calibrate, recalibrate, right? So that's the one part. The interesting part is the AI. So that's going to be one of those things where you do actually introduce a software program of sorts with an algorithm, and there's 2 main parts to that. You can do a black box or a white box system that the algorithm itself starts to learn what is actual truth for where there is a higher degree of threat, right? Those are really powerful. And I'm really excited to see that stuff coming out. I just think that that's fantastic, that we're using more of that big data approach. As they start to look at CDC data, that's what becomes big data, where you take large pools of data and combine them to make better, more informed decisions going forward. So really cool stuff, Eric.
Cool. So the agenda for today, if you were on our last Traceability FSMA Friday, we covered a lot of the rules and some of the specific CTEs and everything. So we're still including those slides today, but we're going to kind of rush through them fairly quickly so we can get to what we want to emphasize and what we didn't cover last time, which is the exemptions and some updates in general about what the FDA has done since our last presentation. And then we'll conclude with kind of records and timelines for enforcement. And we have gotten a little more information on when FDA expects the final rule to be out there, so we have a better idea of when compliance will be mandatory. So starting off, the foods covered by the food traceability list, or the high-risk food list is what it was originated as. So I've really only added in blue text the things that we've added here, and the list hasn't changed since our last presentation, but the FDA has clarified a few aspects just to make sure people know which foods are covered. So you see fresh included there a lot, which I think is going to cause a little bit of questions and everything. Previously, they only had it on herbs, but they've included it for several of the whole fruits and vegetables. And then other than the cheeses, other than hard cheeses, they clarified that any hard cheese is something with less than 39% moisture. But all in all, the list has stayed the same. FDA is still considering comments, so I'll be interested to see how a few of these may change. I know a lot of the comments, particularly from the seafood industry, focused on finfish, and because this list was created by kind of a historic foodborne illness outbreak recall scenario, and a lot of the data from finfish issues with food safety relate to finfish that produce histamines due to improper temperature control. So there are some comments around that, so I'll be interested to see where FDA goes on that. But right now, we're still dealing with more or less this exact list, other than the clarifications for hard cheeses and the fresh fruits and vegetables. So I just wanted to start by redefining some of the key terms here in case anyone needs a little bit of a reminder. So a critical tracking event really is any event in the supply chain that involves growing, receiving, transforming, creating, or shipping food. So when any food on the FTL either changes or changes hands is what a critical tracking event is. And the key data elements are the required records that a company is going to have to keep at each critical tracking event. So those will be outlined in the next slides that we'll skip over a little more quickly, but they vary slightly due to the different considerations or different elements that are happening at the different steps along the supply chain. Reference records are the records that you're going to be maintaining the key data on which you're going to be maintaining the key data elements. And the key here is FDA is saying you really should have all these records already there. So your reference records could be a variety of things, whether it's a bill of lading, a purchase order, shipping notices, work orders, invoices, batch or production logs, or any receipt records that you have. Those are where you're going to find most of the key data elements, where you may have to adapt in order to ensure that they do include the key data elements. And finally, the traceability lot code and traceability product description is kind of not new, but newly defined for this rule, because the traceability lot code isn't going to be something that each person along the supply chain assigns. It's going to be one that should accompany these foods on the food traceability list throughout the entire supply chain. And there's a slight difference in what they call a product description for single product ingredients versus multiple ingredient products, largely just being the single ingredient products are going to need to include the name of the commodity, whereas the other multiple ingredient products are going to be more the product name after it's been processed, or whatever the company is using it as a brand name. But essentially the same thing, just a slight variation. So the general records overview, these are the records that you really should start looking into now to kind of create your traceability program that will be compliant with the traceability rule. So first, you need to start looking into all the foods that are on the food traceability list that you ship, and identifying how you, or naming out or summarizing how you identify those and how you're tracing those through receipt, processing, and shipment. And then kind of a description of the reference records that you're using that maintain the key data elements and how they tie together to facilitate traceability across your process or throughout the supply chain. Finally, kind of a description of where those key data elements are on those reference records. And then you'll need a general summary of how you're establishing your traceability lot codes or maintaining those as they pass through the supply chain. And the final thing is really for the FDA. They want to get these general records from you and be able to understand them. So if you have any unique coding systems or abbreviations that your company use, you'll need to include those in more or less an appendix or a glossary to your program. So the FDA doesn't have to come back to you to be able to understand your records, but they have all the resources there to fully comprehend exactly what you're doing, and don't get caught up in anything that may be unique to your company.
Yeah, so we wanted to just kind of take a quick poll here that I'm going to launch. It just wants to get everyone's quick input. So on your screen, something's going to come up. We're going to ask you to just answer. We don't know who's answering this. It's kind of anonymous. We're not going to share your name or anything. But you know, what best describes your how prepared you are to do this? Let me launch this poll. Sorry about that, Eric. It's just taking a second on my side there. So in a minute, everyone, we're just going to ask that you take a look at that question and be honest in your approach. You want to get the temperature of everyone in the virtual room here on how well would you be able to do something like this within 24 hours. Remember, it's the proposal is having a sortable data set within 24 hours of a request, right? And we know that there's a lot more than just this, right? The processes by which we produce the food, right, have a lot to do with this. So it's not just about having the records, it's how well do the processes produce the data on those checks and everything. So I'm just going to keep this up for a couple more seconds while we do that. Eric, any guess on what we might see? Because after this, we'll share with everyone the poll results.
I'm thinking that data is already in spreadsheets is going to be the leader in the poll.
Yeah.
I think a lot of companies have great traceability programs. It's just the ability to share that traceability of data that is going to be the difficult part.
Yeah, I think we might see a split between that. I think more people are being able to do software. I mean, the software providers are out there. We're definitely helping solve this problem. But we've got 54% that voted. I'm going to close this poll and then we're going to launch it really quick to see what we did. We did have. Well, there you go. Yeah, so you know, we run the whole spectrum, right? A couple people not really quite sure how they would sort of tackle that. Some folks definitely about a full quarter saying, you know, paper, they'd have to manually do some stuff. That's going to cause some, you know, some stress in that facility, maybe just for a day, right? So very impressed to see that we do have a good base of software users in today's presentation. So I'm going to give it back over to you to kind of keep going with the growers part of this.
Sounds great, and that's a good indicator that a lot of people are already utilizing software and things that are out there. So happy to see that. But so these are the specific records requirements are the ones that we're going to kind of breeze through really quickly so we can have a little more time to actually cover all the exemptions this time around. So the first category, the people who are growing food, the growing area coordinates really is the only requirement that they're required to have. So that's going to be the GPS coordinates directly to the location or the farm. And that's kind of defined as the place where you would typically enter the farm. I know that's not great, but it's an idea. GPS coordinates is what you're looking at. Sprouts growers, just like the produce rule, they've got some special requirements that are similar to some of the first receiver requirements that we'll cover on one of the later slides. But really just because there's multiple steps before the sprouter is actually getting the seeds, there's some things in there that the FDA wants to be able to track especially if they're passing through multiple hands. So identifying and describing the location of the person who grew the seeds, anyone who conditioned or processed the seeds, packed the seeds, and supplied the seeds to the sprouter, and including the dates at which each of those different entities or people may have performed those activities, as well as a description of the seeds and supplier lot codes. So that's kind of, is it a mung bean sprout or any other type of seed that you're actually using? So the taxonomic definition of the seed that you're receiving from your supplier, and then the date that you actually received the seeds at your facility in order to sprout them. Next one, receivers, anyone receiving a food on the food traceability list. It's really focused on getting the information from one step back, but these location identifiers, location descriptions, and traceability product identifiers may actually come from more than one step away if they pass through multiple sets of hands or through multiple facilities before they get to a specific receiver. So that'll kind of track through, and it facilitates what FDA is looking at, is trying to get more of an end-to-end traceability program, that the original creator of the traceability lot code and traceability product description, and having that pass through the entire supply chain through multiple entities. First receivers, like I said, they're slightly different than your typical receiver definition. And the key here is the first person other than a farm who purchases and takes physical possession of the food on the food traceability list. So these can be packing houses or warehouses that may take from multiple farms or further down the line. But yeah, you actually have to purchase and take physical possession. So a shared packing house wouldn't necessarily meet the purchase requirement, even though they're taking physical possession. So that'll be a little bit difficult to, or a bit of a process to determine what entails purchase and physical possession of the foods. And then seafood obtained directly from a fishing vessel has slightly different, because multiple fishing vessels may deliver or ship or drop off seafood to a packing house or a warehouse. That person would become the first receiver and may assign a traceability lot code that consists of product from multiple fishing vessels. And they'll be the ones to assign that first traceability lot code. Transformers is kind of a new definition for this rule. And the thing that we want to emphasize here is it's not a complete transformation. It doesn't have to look different or anything like that. It's any event in the supply chain that changes the food on the food traceability list. So it could just be changing the package, moving things from totes to clamshells, or from kind of bulk items down to smaller packaging, or even changing the label is considered a transformation event, where you would need to keep transformation records. And they do differentiate slightly between foods produced through transformation and foods produced used in transformation. And the examples that I am going to use for that is peppers is on the food traceability list. And if you're using fresh peppers and making them into a jalapeno popper, that would be used in transformation, using the food traceability list peppers and transforming it into a new product. And then foods produced through transformation would be things like using tomatoes in a pasta salad. So you're using the tomatoes, which are already on the list, but you're also creating or transforming them into another item that is on the food traceability list, your deli salad or pasta salad. And so the records are a little bit different, but more or less the same. The transformation through, just you're going to have to pass more information on to your customer or the people who are going to be selling that product. Creators, this is where you're creating a food on the food traceability list that does not contain any ingredients that are on the food traceability list. So the prime example here is peanut butter, typically made from peanuts and maybe some salt or a sweetener or emulsifier or something like that. But none of those peanuts or anything are on the food traceability list, but nut butters are. And so you'd be subject to these creation records which are outlined right there. Shippers, this is largely just the information that you're going to have to send down the line. So previously, this wasn't prescribed and certain things were always shared, and a lot of them are already shared, but these are the records that you're going to need to ensure that you actually ship to the next person down the line. So covering all those kind of records and everything, and FDA's push for more software and tech-enabled traceability initiatives, we did want to just touch on the FDA Food Traceability Challenge, which closes today. But so last month, FDA opened up a portal more or less so people could submit tech-enabled traceability solutions and platforms to the FDA for review. And the whole idea was to get more talk about tech-enabled traceability hardware, software that would be low or no cost to the end user, because part of this, you have a lot of small companies that may not have the software and things to create the traceability lists or create the spreadsheets quickly, and they realize there's an economic difficulty for those. The FDA wants to create a way so resources are more readily available and affordable. So like I said, that closes today, so we hope to see the winners sometime soon, and the FDA will be announcing 12 winners. There's no cash award or anything for this, but the thing that the submittees get from this is FDA is basically going to endorse their platform and create a portion of their website that has either videos or explanations of exactly what these entail, which would be a boon to these businesses or entrepreneurs that are creating these programs to get more business and more clients.
Yeah. And this is important. Again, this is really helping to support that new era, that the tech-enabled traceability part of the new era, smarter food safety. But I want to note very quickly, Eric, this is not like the fix. This is not how it's going to work, because ultimately, when you have disparate systems like software providers, generally speaking, those data sets don't mesh with each other just magically, right? There's a lot of programming and engineering that goes into being able to take disparate data sets, putting them together. But overall, fantastic news. I'm really looking forward to seeing who comes out and wins.
Definitely, and it will be interesting as how those coordinate with existing programs and softwares and how they can be co-utilized to get a better system.
Yep.
One second.
Yeah, I think you got to click on my screen again. Excuse me.
There we go. So wanted to touch on exemptions and everything, and we're running out of time a bit, so I'll go through these. But first, kill steps. If you have a validated kill step along the supply chain for something on the food traceability list, basically it stops the requirement to keep the food traceability records. You'll still have the receipt records and anything beforehand, but as soon as the kill step is applied and it's been validated, the requirements for shipping and subsequent processing are not going to be necessary. So as far as the supply chain goes, people will be looking into getting information about the validated kill steps that people may be applying to ensure that they are not going to be subject to the traceability records requirements. So there's a pretty large list of exemptions and partial exemptions that I'm going to cover, but small originators, just frequently FDA has different rules for small companies, so or small producers. So small originators are going to be completely exempt from the rule. So produce farms that are not covered by the produce safety rule, shell egg producers with less than 3,000 laying hens, or any establishment with less than $25,000 in annual food sales. Another big exemption is farms when food is sold directly to the consumers. So this is your farmers markets, farm stands, all that sort of thing. The farm is not going to need to keep these sort of records. And when you think about it, with the idea being end-to-end traceability, those type of situations, the consumer and the farmer already have end-to-end traceability kind of within the system because there's not multiple steps. So that's why they're going to be exempt. And that this third bullet point really fits in that category as well, with some caveats for things that need to happen. That if a farm packages food on the farm and the packaging maintains the integrity of the food, prevents contamination, and the same labeling that the farm put on the food is still on the food when the consumer purchases it, which includes their address and phone number, they're not going to have to keep additional records either, because really the end-to-end traceability is apparent and inherent in the in that marketing method. So we already touched on kill steps, but there's another little section that basically says commercially processed food that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms. So that's going to be the type of 5-log reduction. And there are some sections of the produce safety rule that talk about what they consider adequate, as well as shell eggs that are treated or pasteurized to a 5-log reduction as well are going to be exempt from this rule. So they kind of fit right in that kill step exemption. As well, there's the produce that is rarely consumed raw is going to be exempt from the rule. So that list is from the produce safety rule as well. So it's fairly long, but asparagus, beans, cranberries, sweet potatoes, water chestnuts, hazelnuts, eggplant, ginger, lentils. There's a good variety, but I have the site there so that you can look at it. And then just a couple quick ones to touch on. Transporters are exempt. Nonprofit food establishments are exempt. Any person that is storing or holding food for personal consumption is exempt. And then finally, the one that I think is going to cause a little consternation in the industry is persons holding food on behalf of others when they are not party to the transaction and are not in the business of distributing food. So temporary holding warehouses that are as a pure storage, and that's likely because the party that is a party to the transaction or had purchased the food or is kind of in charge of the overall distribution, they're going to be keeping the traceability records in those instances. Partial exemptions, commingled raw agricultural commodities. So this is really where you're mixing products from multiple farms, that they're not going to be totally covered by the rule. They are exempt unless the facility that is commingling the racks is required to register with the FDA, and then they would just need the records identifying the immediate previous sources of the racks. So the farm GPS location would be key there. Retail food establishments, so this goes a little bit beyond what I talked about earlier with the farmers markets and anything. If a retail establishment purchases food directly from a farm, they really only need to keep the records of the name and address of the farm. And people operating under the farm to school and farm to institution programs, where the farm is selling directly to the school or an institution like a prison or a hospital or something, those purchasers are just going to need to keep the farm information, but are not going to keep additional records. And those records it's typically a 180-day requirement. Finally, fishing vessels, similar to the other partial exemption, unless the fishing vessel is required to register with the FDA, they are going to be exempt from the rule. But if they do register with the FDA due to some of the processing or something that they may do on the vessel, then they're going to have to keep records of the immediate previous source of food. So that would be if they're receiving fish or something from another vessel and then conducting further processing that would require FDA registration. Smaller retailers, I just wanted to touch on this. Because there's two options that the FDA proposed, and depending on how the comments go, one of these options will be selected. If a retail establishment employs 10 or fewer full-time equivalent employees on site, not company-wide, so it's each individual location, FDA proposed two options, one being a total exemption, and the option two being just exempt from the requirement to provide the electronic sortable spreadsheet upon FDA request, which we'll touch on in a little bit here. So there's some options for those smaller retail establishments, and something to pay attention to and watch as the final rule is finalized. So, record maintenance and availability, the whole idea, similar to so many other FDA rules, is when FDA requests the rules, you basically have 24 hours to give them. And then this other one that brings in this electronic sortable spreadsheet is instances in which FDA needs to prevent or mitigate a foodborne illness or outbreak, assist with a recall, or address any public health issue. So that is when the covered establishments or covered entities are going to have to provide an electronic sortable spreadsheet that would contain basically the foods that FDA has requested information on, as well as the dates they were received or sold there. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out, because as you see, that first definition, if necessary, it's broad. So FDA is basically almost always working to prevent or mitigate foodborne illness outbreaks and recalls. So that could be a fairly broad and ready requirement for a lot of people. It's not going to be the exception. Probably will be a little bit more of the standard.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to insert too. The ASAP part of this, right? If you have the right software, it can be push button simple. You can create these things, and it's not necessarily about making it that simple for you to get this done. But oftentimes, what you'll start to recognize is the confidence that the FDA has in your facility in being able to provide this very quickly to them. It's helpful, and that helps just the overall the relationship between your facility and the FDA. It really does. If you're able to show up very quickly with the records, you're in a great spot.
Exactly. Great point. So just to conclude, we wanted to touch on timelines and enforcement, which we do have a slight update from the last time. And honestly, I had, with this being such a priority in the new era of smarter food safety, I had been predicting that we would see a final rule possibly by the end of this year, if not the beginning of 2022. But in some of these one-year anniversary updates from the FDA on the new era of smarter food safety, they have said that they have an estimated timeline for the final rule to be published at the end of 2022. So I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that sometime in Q4. But the whole idea behind the enforcement of the rule is going to end up being 2 years after that. So we may not see really enforcement of the traceability rule until 2025, with the final rule not being done until the end of 2022. And that's largely a statutory restriction that the FDA has. When Congress passed the statute, they said you can't require small companies to comply with this. Well, you have to allow them 2 years to comply. And FDA looked at it and said, well, we can't really phase this in for large companies first and small companies second, because if everyone's not doing traceability, it's not going to work. And so they basically said, we'll give everyone 2 years. And just as a reference for people who are kind of figuring out where they may fit into these, FDA has some great supplemental materials on their website that I have the site down there at the bottom that really goes through different scenarios when you may be transforming or creating, and gives outlines for seafood, produce, peanut butter crackers, lots of different ideas. So you can determine and see an example of when the rule may apply to you and which key data elements you may have to maintain for a different critical tracking event. But with that, we went a little over, but I'm available for questions and answer as needed.
Yeah, so this is great. We were with you on that, Eric. We really thought it would be much closer to the kind of rollout than what it is. This is pushing it back a bit, and I think you mentioned it was Frank Yanis provided some clarification most recently. So it's our job to just keep everyone informed. So I appreciate you keeping on top of everything. So got a couple of questions for you. First one from Gerson. Based on this list, the RTE deli salads would include, what would that include? Like tuna, for example, tuna salad. So they were talking about the ready-to-eat deli salads. Can you comment on that? Any other examples?
I'm sorry, my audio cut out for just a second. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, no worries, no worries. It's a hard, so Gerson asks, well, poses this, based on this list, and this was earlier when we were going through the FTLs, the RTE deli salads would include, for example, tuna salad. Can you just talk openly a little bit about how a deli salad such as tuna would be involved in this?
Yeah, it's really any ready-to-eat deli salad. So a tuna salad is going to fall into this kind of transformation event, and then but it's potato salads and pasta salads, anything created, and that's largely just because of the potential food safety risks with those.
Okay, thank you. This, I thought we'd have a little bit of questions about just kind of that first receiver, right? So is the first receiver the transporter from the farm or the buyer of the commodity, if the transporter is not the buyer?
So the transporter is going to be exempt from the rule unless they're kind of coordinated with it. But yeah, it would have to be the buyer that takes physical possession of the food. So if you're just brokering, you're not really going to be covered by this because you're never taking physical possession. But yeah, the transporter would largely be exempt unless they're associated with the person who buys and takes possession of the food at a packing house or something like that.
All right, great. And I hope that helps Lori. That's a good answer. Thanks, Eric. Next up is, where does salad dressings like Thousand Island fit into the traceability conversation here?
It really depends on the ingredients in those salad dressings, but for the most part, the dressings are not going to be included on the traceability list at all, because the finished product isn't going to. There may be something there where you're using ingredients from the food traceability list, so you'd have receiving records on that. But yeah, salad dressings are not directly covered by the rule at this point. Unless they have, it's kind of really fact based on the ingredients and how they would be tied into the rule.
Yeah, because I think some of it, I'm not, first of all, love salad dressings, but don't know how to make them. I think some of them do have the egg and some of the things that would, the thickening agents and stuff. So that was a good question, Mark. Thanks for asking. So we've got a question from Julie, whose company imports and wholesales instant coffee and tea products from various manufacturers globally. Company has 9 employees out of New York City. Does that make them exempt? She was thinking of that small, I think she was kind of thinking of that smaller business exemption.
So the 10 employee is only for retail establishments, but the small exemption, so it's going to depend on your annual food sales. If you have less than 25,000 in annual food sales, you may be exempt. And I'd be happy to touch base offline on this one, because another point I'd like to say, coffee and tea are not on the food traceability list. And so you may not be covered solely based on the fact that you're not dealing with any products that are listed.
Got it. And Julie, thanks for that. We'll make sure that Eric gets that question and we can connect you past this. So here's a great question. It's really just an opinion. We don't have crystal balls here, but should we, John asks, should we expect substantial revision either to the FTL or the overall rule from feedback during the comment period?
There's not typically major changes. So the proposed rule is going to provide a really great guideline for what to expect. If there are slight changes, I think they're going to be relatively minor. So kind of how I mentioned how there's been lots of comments on whether all fin fish or just histamine producing fin fish should be included. And then one thing that I expect to be a little bit different is there's a lot of concern about how retail establishments are going to maintain these records. And I'm looking forward to some clarification, some slight changes there. But typically the proposed rule, unless there's something blatantly wrong, which there doesn't seem to be too many terrible things about this, it stays relatively the same.
Yeah, and you could see that the very small little nuances are going on. I don't expect anything substantial to be added. They've gotten a pretty comprehensive list to start with. I would hazard my own opinion here, which is we won't see anything new being added to that. It's comprehensive. It's just clarifying through, some minor details. That's all. So
yeah, and that's a
Julie,
good point, Aaron. Lots of times the questions and comments that are given to the FDA through the public comment period provides FDA an opportunity to clarify exactly what is covered, but the nuts and bolts kind of stay in place.
Yeah, exactly. Julie commented after we answered her question. She just said, this was, if you remember, coffee tea. She said she has a lot of traceability measures already in place and have FSVP in place, which is what I was thinking she'd be more bound to, which is the forward supplier. So Julie, thanks for that again. Margaret asks, are canned fish included in the traceability rule?
Well, they would be basically until they're canned, if that makes sense. So we mentioned the kill step. So the fish are going to be covered up until the point that they're received at the facility that cans them. And I'm personally not aware of any canning process that doesn't include some sort of kill step, at least in your typical canned tunas and things. So you're going to have receipt records and records of your kill step or process validation, but then subsequent shipping of canned items that have been treated are likely not going to have the same shipping records and things like that.
Yep. That makes sense. Good. John asked a question. So Eric, you and I, before we started the presentation, were kind of behind the, backstage, if you will. We were talking a little bit. I had the same question as John here. He asked, what should we expect enforcement to look like? Will there be evaluations on data accuracy or merely the ability to reproduce data? I think that's a really important question to tackle.
Yeah, and I mean, right now, the idea, and we don't know exactly what it would look like, but failure to comply with the food traceability rule is basically going to fall into one of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act's prohibited actions. So enforcement could be something as little as a kind of civil penalty, but it could go into other things in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic. It does allow criminal things and whatnot, but right now I'm predicting it's going to be largely a potential for civil penalties, and you could get to the point where you could get a warning letter for failure to keep traceability records, but it's not going to be your typical kind of 483 facility inspection type of thing, but it will fall into that same category.
Okay, so that's a good distinction. And my question to you was, is this a 483 thing, right? And you said no, it's more on the civil side. Which, hey, let's avoid it all. My thing is just like we've got some more time to figure this out, and you may want to start to look at adjusting your internal audit regimen to stress test this. Is my best guidance for everyone still on the call. Test your teams, right? It's coming. So we do have someone that ask.
Will come into play a little bit, like we've seen with the foreign supplier verification program being the most frequent kind of cited 483 issue recently. So it would be that's FDA's first move for kind of an action, but failure to keep traceability records isn't necessarily going to result in like a recall, because it's just a problem with your records, not indicating a direct problem with the food.
Yep. Good clarification. Thank you, Eric. Mark asked us to just run back to this slide really quick, so he did. He asked, could you go back to the shipper slide and clarify the definition as to who this applies to? So who's the I think what we're trying to get to is, can you define what a shipper is in this case?
A shipper is going to be anyone who sends a food that's on the food traceability list to another entity.
Cool. And he said, thanks, got it. So, all right. Well, we have a few other questions. We're going to wrap it up here, though, Eric. Thank you very much for joining FSMA Friday. Again, this has been super helpful. We'll be back at it again next month. And my guess is I've got a producer, Ann, that puts these things together, and I think we're going to probably see that list, the awards, coming out. So, a couple upcoming things to keep in mind. Head over to TAG, get their newsletter. If you haven't done this, do it right away. Their newsletter is super jam-packed with awesome stuff. We also have more resources on safetychain.com, full content library of FSMA Friday. Check us out on LinkedIn. Go join the group. Get in there. And don't forget, we got a webinar coming up August 11th for the Beyond Compliance, Foolproof Statistical Methods for Process and Product Optimization. This is really cool. It's going to be kind of geeky, a little mathy, but definitely it'll show a good path to increasing yields and keeping productivity high. And then we also have best practices, the top 10 auditing mistakes companies make. So we've got a good list of stuff coming up. We appreciate everyone joining us today. That'll wrap it up for FSMA Friday. Again, Eric, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
All right. That'll do it, folks. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us.